Hello, welcome everybody. Gonna wait just a couple minutes for the room to fill. Looks like it's filling very quickly. So that's great. We're very glad that you're here. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Dan Fagan, and I'm a professor of science journalism at New York University and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program. And this is the first Kavli Conversation of 2021. As always, we're very grateful to the Kavli Foundation for making this possible. We've got many more Kavli Conversations scheduled, including one next week, a week from today, about science in the White House, science policy making at the highest level, how to cover that well, and how to think about the interaction between science and politics. And then a week after that, March the 11th, we have a Kavli Conversation on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, which I frankly do not understand, but feel like I really need to understand. I'm about 5 years late in understanding. So I'm really looking forward to that one too. That's on March 11th. And the key message is that these are Zoom webinars, so you do need to register for them. And the place to do that is at journalism.nyu.edu/KC for Kavli Conversation. It's an honor, really, to welcome Katherine Foley, who will be our moderator. Katherine is a 2015 graduate of SHRP, the program that I direct. Seems like she was just here, but it's been more than 5 years. She's a science and health reporter at Quartz, and a remarkably good one. She writes, well, lately she's been just reporting the heck out of the pandemic and vaccines, but in a more general sense, she writes about health disparities, bioethics, including about a year ago, a 6-part series on the business of fertility that she called Big Bucks Baby, I think. So I immediately thought of her as a great person to serve as moderator. Katherine will formally introduce our other two guests, but I just wanted to briefly say thank you to Antonio Regalado, who is also a graduate of our program, but before my time, who is a hell of a reporter, and also to Dr. Norbert Gleicher, who is both a leading practitioner in the field and also a leading thinker in this field. And thus a really perfect person to have as part of this discussion. Just quick ground rule. Instead of using the chat box, we very much encourage you to ask questions, but use the Q&A box. So see the little Q&A down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Katherine will be keeping an eye on that and will work your questions into the conversation. So please use the Q&A box liberally. We would love to hear from you. And with that, I will turn off my screen to avoid distracting everybody, but I'll be listening avidly. So take it away, Katherine.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. As Dan said, it's really awesome to be here tonight with Antonio Regalado, the biomedicine editor at MIT Tech Review. Most recently, his work has been focused on how the field of biomedicine has influenced the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the past, he's covered the business of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, CRISPR, including breaking one of the biggest stories on Chinese scientists genetically editing embryos, and the fertility industry. His work examines the science and ethics behind each of the companies he covers. And he has a long history of reporting in these fields because before joining MIT Tech Review, he lived in Brazil and was a Latin American contributor for Science magazine. And before that, he covered science for the Wall Street Journal. Also with us tonight is Dr. Norbert Gleicher, an obstetrician and gynecologist at the Center for Human Reproduction in New York, where he specializes in fertility medicine. He's been a pioneer in the field of reproductive endocrinology, and his career has helped so many people have children, including a 48-year-old woman who became one of the oldest, or the oldest person in the US to give birth to a healthy baby with her own eggs. And before his tenure at the Center for Human Reproduction, he was chairman of the Obstetrics and Gynecology Department at Mount Sinai Hospital, and he has taught obstetrics and gynecology and immunology and microbiology at multiple universities. He is also the co-founder of a young company called Ova Nova Labs, which has the goal of being able to use a person's stem cells to create germ cells and study the way they implant in a uterus. So I'm wondering if we can start with you, Dr. Gleicher. Could we talk broadly about the trajectory of fertility medicine in the past 50 years or so? And maybe you can elaborate on how the study of embryology has changed from early in vitro fertilization to all the services that are available today, including various types of pre-implantation genetic testing, egg retrieval and freezing, and other add-ons to fertility medicine, like endometrial scratching or artificial hatching.
Okay, it's my pleasure being here. I think you have chosen a wonderful subject to talk about, because in vitro fertilization has changed dramatically. It has been maybe the most successful medical treatment ever invented or at least in recent decades invented. If you look at it from the outcome, we are approaching 10 million human beings who would not be on this earth with great likelihood if IVF had not come about roughly 40 years ago. And I would like to propose a little mind game about what would you think, or what would the public think about somebody who developed a medication that saved the lives of 10 million people. I would argue that that person would win the Nobel Prize in Medicine within a relatively short time period. I'm mentioning this because it took Bob Edwards 20 years, or even more, before he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. And he won it barely, because he was not capable any longer to accept it himself. I think that tells us something about the field of IVF, in which I had the honor of participating from practically the very beginning. It is a unique area in medicine for a whole variety of reasons. It is unique because it is really the only specialty in medicine that has the ability to establish life, human life. It is unique in medicine because it also controls information about early embryonic stages. And we now know, and we now understand, that the zygote, that first cell that starts a human being, has all the genetic information that represents us. And therefore, the embryology has not only enormous relevance for infertility, but has enormous relevance for all of medicine, because all the knowledge about cancer, about tissue regeneration, about everything is right there in that early stages of human existence. And IVF also has been probably the only area in medicine, at least in this country, that never received a single federal dollar in research support. And in other words, the quick development of IVF from being a highly experimental procedure to becoming a routine clinical procedure happened without federal funds. It was self-financed by the IVF industry. And I think that is a remarkable fact that is very frequently overlooked. It is unfortunately also, in more recent times, probably what I view as the biggest problem that we are today facing in IVF, which is the commercialization of this field, which is probably further progressed than other areas in medicine, maybe with the exception of plastics, but maybe even more than that. And this commercialization and the resulting developments from so much money coming in from the outset of the specialty and from Wall Street has very, very significant consequences on the field in many ways, and is frankly an issue that is deeply troubling me in my thinking about the future of the field. And I think I stop here and will be happy to answer questions and discuss further issues.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. Antonio, I'm wondering how this commercialization changes how you've covered the fertility industry over time, and how I guess the fact that the industry, or that fertility medicine is entirely funded by industry, changes the way that you go about covering fertility, any development in the fertility space.
Yeah, thanks. I think we'll get back to Norbert maybe to tell us what kind of money he's talking about. I think it is the roll up of fertility clinics into large groups, like big practice groups of doctors who leverage their combined expertise, and that's the money. Whereas I'm a technology reporter from the biotech industry, so I'm looking for, is this a biotech industry, or isn't it? And I think that actually is an important question as well. I always say I cover sort of the brave new world side of fertility medicine. So it's the novelty, it's some new technology, new technique, which are always springing up in labs, CRISPR, gene sequencing, cloning, et cetera. There's all these new technologies that can be imposed or used on the embryo. And you could generate people that are different than any other people that have come before, because they have different genes, or they've been selected because they have certain genes. So that's the sort of dramatic intersection of technology and the embryo that I'm interested in. And on the flip side of that, Dr. Gleicher said something that I think is super important, is that the embryo is the source of technology. It's the source of new technology. Embryonic stem cells is the perfect example, right? These cells that can become anything, they can be grown in a lab dish, but they kind of retain an aspect of the embryo, this potential. And that's not the end of the story, right? There's the embryo is eyed as this basically kind of, immortality. It's somehow in that embryo. Like you and I, Dr. Gleicher started out with very profound comments, and so I want to be equally profound, which is why I'm going in this direction. But seriously, the secret of immortality is in that embryo, because you and I, we're mortal, but barring a asteroid strike, organismal life or human life is just goes on and on. So I think a lot of people are excited about the embryo for that reason. Getting back to the biotech part of the question, or the industry part of the question, it is not normal biotech, right? Normal biotech is sort of a new method, and the venture capitalists come in and they give you $30 million, and you spend 2 or 3 years developing this technology in the lab, applied research, sort of perfecting it, making it precise. And then you go through a process of developing a drug or a gene therapy and trying it on patients, and you have a regulator, the FDA, and then you have to present your evidence. Can you prove your thing works? and then you get permission to go to market and sell your product and start making money. But none of that happens really, in my opinion, in the fertility industry. You already pointed out there's no investment. The investment is forbidden. You know, embryo research with tax dollars is forbidden. So you don't have that basis of research. You don't have these investors coming in that often to deploy new technology. You don't have a system of gathering that same kind of evidence that you would on a drug, like double-blind trials. And then you also don't, at the end, you don't get a clearly defined sort of biotech product. So it's not a normal industry from a biotech perspective. It's stunted.
One thing I had wanted to add after Dr. Gleicher gave us that intro is I wanted to point out, just with regard to the Nobel Prize, that Jean Purdy was actually left off that prize. She was an embryologist who worked in Edwards' lab and was not credited when he did win that prize. But anyway, I would love to go back to Dr. Gleicher again and talk a little bit about how that sort of tech process and development changes the way that fertility medicine has been practiced over time. And maybe you could talk a little bit too, like I'm super interested in the costs of all of these treatments and what the fact that it is sort of in the tech space does to these costs for patients.
Okay, so Antonio was absolutely correct when he made the point that we are not the tech industry in reproductive medicine in the in the classical sense. At least the IVF process is not, for a whole variety of reasons. Nevertheless, unprecedented funds are coming into the field all over the world, and not only in the US. Actually, this trend started the quickest in recent years in Australia and New Zealand, out of all places, where I think 3 companies control over 2/3 of the IVF cycle market. And Australia, because they were a little ahead of us and of Europe and of Asia in those developments, Australia also gives us some of the answers that you asked for. So the argument for outside the funds coming in and buying up IVF centers and aggregating them into larger networks is always the same. It is, okay, we will become more efficient, we will learn best practices, therefore quality will improve, it will get cheaper, etc. Truth, however, is that when you really look at the outcome data, exactly the opposite is happening, or has been happening. And Australia is a very good example. When you look at Australia's live birth rates after IVF cycles, they have constantly been declining in the last decade. And not only in Australia. We have seen remarkable declines in the US. Nobody's talking about it, but that's the fact. And I'll be happy to explain why I think that is. Costs in Australia have gone up. And patient satisfaction has also gone down. So one really must ask, why is that? Because it is contrary to what basic economics are teaching us. The concept of aggregating and developing best practices, etc., obviously makes at least theoretical sense. But it is another example of why in medicine you cannot rely on hypothesis. You know, there are millions of great ideas out there in medicine every single day because there are a lot of very smart people working in medicine. But out of 100 drugs pharmaceutical companies start, only a tiny minority in the end work out. And those are already 100 highly selected drugs. The same thing applies in medicine. Just because something sounds good doesn't mean it is good. Just because it makes all the sense in the world doesn't mean it will work in practice. And probably one of the best examples is one of the most controversial issues in our field in recent years, which is the chromosomal testing of embryos before transferring them back into the uterus. The person who developed this concept was a close friend of mine in Chicago when I still lived in Chicago. He was actually a competitor, but we were close friends. And he was so convincing with this argument that testing embryos will revolutionize IVF that I actually started building a laboratory for that purpose and hired a person to run it. But it hasn't worked out. But it has become a gigantic industry, a millions of dollar industry all over the world, with estimates now suggesting that roughly half of all IVF cycles in the US undergo this test, which is basically worthless and in many patients actually harms outcomes. So this difference between what sounds good and is good is a very basic problem in medicine, but the consequences have changed. In the old days, in the very early days of IVF, where we had very poor pregnancy rates, it was relatively easy to know whether something works or not. Because if you run single-digit pregnancy rates, and if you suddenly, even with small cycle numbers, go to double digits, you know that you have changed something that works. In other words, it doesn't take large prospectively randomized studies that Antonio referred to. It was very easy, therefore, at the beginning to make quick progress. But that progress in our field has stagnated. When you really ask me what significant progress has been made in the last 20 years, I will have a hard time pointing out things. Yes, there's marginal stuff happening here and there, but really nothing of significance. And therefore, those changes that have been brought in, our British colleagues have given it the name add-ons to IVF. They have significantly impacted IVF, but almost none of them has been validated. There are companies formed left and right that sell tests, that sell algorithms, that do all kinds of things that affect how we practice IVF, really without any evidence, just because they say so, and which closes the circle where I started. Just because something sounds great doesn't mean it works. It sometimes harms. And what works in one patient group may not work in another patient group. And unless we find a way to change how we change our practice over the last 10 years, I think what we have been witnessing, that pregnancy rates after 30 years of steady rises now over the last few years have precipitously dropped, I think we will continue seeing that.
It sounds a little bit like what you're saying is in some spaces, there's been this application of new technology just applied to fertility medicine, and there isn't really that opportunity to see if it's actually improving things, even if it should in theory. Antonio, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about following some of these breakthroughs in biomedicine and seeing how they're applied to fertility medicine. Is that like a correct assessment? Is that sort of what we're seeing, or are you noticing other trends in tech that's being developed in the ways that it's being applied to fertility medicine?
Just unmute myself. Oh yeah, there's this Promethean need to apply the latest thing to the embryo. So as soon as something happens in the lab, CRISPR being the perfect example, as soon as this possibility arises, you know that there's somebody out there who will not be able to resist trying it because of the structure, in a way, of the IVF industry, which is that the research part or the cutting edge part is led by really, I don't know, a dozen centers, a dozen people practically in the world, half of them in New York City, who have clinics that are big enough and the interest to do this cutting edge research and to try and advance the field. So you can be sure that someone's going to try it, and then as a journalist, it's a matter of sort of finding out who that might be. You know, it's called like cowboy science. Even Steptoe and Edwards are accused of being cowboys, you know, because they had made, you know, rabbits, but then the jump to humans, they just had to make the jump. That's the cowboy step. So that's the kind of the way the news arises.
Can you talk a little bit more, Antonio, about how you go about like reporting on stuff that is so new, there isn't a ton of data to back it up yet, and people who are doing it have this vested financial interest in selling their capabilities?
They do. I mean, it's a business. So the people who are doing the innovation are sort of physician entrepreneurs. There's a very good example in New York, a guy named John Zhang, who has just built a huge empire of fertility clinics, and also is one of the most daring experimenters. So he's a good example of how that is combined. In terms of getting to the story, the nice thing about it is still a pretty small world. So I mentioned these meetings. Just for the journalists, going to the meeting is invaluable because there's only like 20 or 30 actors. I mean, a lot of people are doing fertility medicine. I think Dr. Gleicher kind of referenced the kind of a McDonald's approach to fertility medicine, where it's an algorithm or a cookbook, and they're just trying to do it. In terms of the new stuff, it's a smaller group. I was in this meeting in New York, and it was in a hotel, and you know, there's probably 30, 40 people in the room, and they were having these arguments, these heated arguments about PGD. And so it was really fun as a reporter to be there. And also interesting because, you know, I'm often in conflict with some of these scientists because you report on them and, you know, they've done something kind of edgy, but they still welcome you to their meeting because, you know, I think they believe passionately in science, in making progress. And so even if you're a critic, they still let you in the room. And so that's a really helpful way to do it. And also because, like a lot of academia, everybody's kind of related to everybody else. They've trained with one another. It's a, you know, so-and-so begat so-and-so situation. So pretty quickly you can create kind of a mental map of who's who. And that's kind of how I then, you know, you kind of figure out who's working on what.
Yeah, it sounds like there's sort of it's easier to get into the beat with it being a little bit smaller, with the characters or the players being smaller in number. It is.
You can kind of, you could sort of understand it somewhat comprehensively, unlike some other fields that are just too gigantic.
Yeah. Dr. Gleicher, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how all of these like new add-ons have changed the way that you practice medicine when clients come in and are having reproductive troubles. Are they asking for new services? My understanding from reporting on this field is a lot of people, when they're going through this, are quite desperate. And, you know, without insurance covering it, they're looking at major financial costs in addition to racing against the clock to, I guess, achieve the dream of reproducing. What does that look like? What does practicing fertility look like for you?
Yeah, it's exactly as you describe it. It is one of the most vulnerable populations that we are serving with. I mean, a woman who feels she cannot become a mom will do almost anything to achieve that goal. And that is, I think, one of the big problems we are facing, because I think that vulnerability is in many ways abused. And also, not only as we see it at our center, because our center, I don't like to bring our center into too much of this discussion, but our center is unique in that it serves the oldest, by far the oldest patient population of all US centers, and over 90% who come to us are patients who have failed usually multiple cycles at multiple centers all over the world, and over 60% are long distance patients. In other words, they're not in the local, from the local tri-state area. So we serve a very unique patient population, and therefore I'm not sure that the patients we see are representative of the whole IVF field. But when I'm talking about abuse, I'm also talking about another major development in our specialty, which is the switch from being providers of a very essential and revolutionary treatment to being providers of an elective service. And what I'm referring to is this whole egg freezing mania that has been happening, and fortunately, I think has calmed down a little bit. But that has made a huge impact on our field because suddenly here was another opportunity for revenue generation. And when you then read about egg freezing parties where the alcohol flows and sandwiches are served and young women are asked to sign their consents while they had 3 cocktails, you really have to wonder about where the field has gone to, and it is troubling to me, and particularly again because this is purely a marketing game. You know, many of those centers that were established initially to serve this egg freezing boom were not even real full IVF centers. You know, they were just freezing eggs. And they were financed almost universally by outside finance interests, not by doctors. So it was a business that was created out of air and was marketed very successfully. Since we're talking about media, I think partially, at least initially, to a degree also hyped by some of the media reporting that happened.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That was one of the questions that one of our viewers had submitted is, I guess, how has fertility technology moved beyond simply treating infertility, and how has it really helped either people who want to delay becoming pregnant or people who are not in heterosexual relationships to have children? In addition to I suppose you sort of touched on some of the ethics around some of this marketing, Dr. Gleicher, but I guess, Antonio, I'm wondering what you have seen reporting on the tech in this space, and if you see any parallels if you see some of the parallels that Dr. Gleicher was talking about in terms of just a really technology that has made something possible and then wants to sell that product.
Well, the egg freezing is interesting. I was surprised to hear his sort of skeptical take on egg freezing. I mean, it kind of works, right? Doesn't it? Maybe not.
It works as it works.
Okay.
It does not work how it is being sold, because the way it has been sold is as an insurance. And I always tell our patients, you know, when you buy insurance, car insurance, health insurance, and insurance on your house, you know exactly what you're purchasing. And you know, if you get sick, you'll have coverage. If you are in a car crash, your car will get repaired. You know what you're buying. Egg freezing is not insurance, because nobody can tell you till today with reasonable reliability how many eggs you should freeze to have a 85% probability of having at least one child. We have estimates. We have rough numbers. But they are exactly that. They apply to large volumes. They do not apply to the individual patient. I see all the time patients who froze 30 eggs, and when they start thawing them out, none of them survives, or after fertilization, none of them makes it to blastocyst stage. And that's when they come to us at age 43, because they relied on those eggs that they had to wait.
Right. Yeah. So this trend has been kind of furthered by Facebook and other companies that offer this as a perk.
Yeah.
Have your career first and have children later. In terms of the media reporting, I can think back to the beginning of this other kind of a related insurance, which is saving the umbilical cord cells. This kind of came up in the whole stem cell debate. Save the umbilical cord cells. Because they could save your kid's life later on. It can be used as kind of a bone marrow transplant or something. And I do remember writing a story about that. And, I looked at it very carefully, and I decided to put the rosiest, also in a statistical way, like what was the chance your child would have like leukemia or something and need their own cord blood, which is like bone marrow stem cells, and need it back. And so the odds are very low. They're very low. So it's not actually worth taking out this insurance, which costs money to freeze the umbilical cord. It's not worth it. And just as a journalist, I said, okay, well, I'm not going to write the article and just say don't do it. But I said, well, the only reason to do it was, maybe if you're counting on sort of future technology, right? Like maybe in the future there's some kind of super therapy or gene therapy or cloning even, where they need fresh cells. So it would be a way. It's like buying a risky stock, it's like to go along for the ride. It might be one reason to do it. But actually, when it got edited, it turned into this very positive story about why you should save stem cells. And this was a journalistic emergency, because the edit came back to me at 5. There's a newspaper, and it was going to go to press at like 5:30. So I was like, oh my God, I can't have my name on this. There's a long way of saying, when you're dealing with fertility, everybody, including the journalists, have a view. And many of them are actually seeking out these services, or need these services, or have done these services. So it's hard to be unbiased about it. It's hard to write an article that says, for instance, egg freezing doesn't work, don't do it. If 25% of the people in the newsroom have already paid for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are also some issues, or like, I guess, difficulty reporting on this field when that is someone's only option to have kids. So if you look in the case of either people who are diagnosed with cancer at an early age, or people who are transgender and want gender confirming hormones, and don't know if they need to save their gametes or not. I think the field of fertility medicine for trans folks is still like emerging. And I was just kind of shocked that there isn't, it seems like, not that the doctors are flying blind, but they're really just seeing what works best for their patients on like a case-by-case basis. And they've got like a handful of studies about like what is safe and how you can safely either store gametes, or in some cases like of kids who don't want to go through puberty, of I guess like ovarian or testy tissue, to see if you can develop that into gametes later on. I think that's really cool, but I think it goes back to this idea of banking on future technology for when you might be ready to have children. Because I mean, what child knows if they want to be a parent one day? That's a really big decision. Dr. Gleicher, I want to address another question that I think is sort of possibly related to some of these technological add-ons and whatnot. You've alluded to the fact that fertility rates through IVF are falling. Could you elaborate a little bit more on why you think that is, or be more specific with why you think that is?
Yeah, as I said before, when you look at the US and basically anywhere in the world, even though there are data being reported, nobody talks about them. And that is interesting. Nobody talks about them even within our field. And even most colleagues, when we published a year or two ago a paper showing those declines, a lot of colleagues called me up or texted me how surprised they were about the data and how is that possible? When for 30 years, everything steadily improved. Well, the answer is that associations obviously are not causation in medicine. That is one of the ground rules of research. Just because you see two things happening in parallel does not mean that A leads to B. But when you see the same thing happening in the US and in Europe and in Asia and in Australia at the same time with introduction of certain things, it makes it highly likely that there is indeed a cause and effect relationship. And there is really hardly any doubt left that over the last 10, 11, 12 years, which is the time of the introduction of all of these new things in IVF, rates initially that, as I said, for 30 years had constantly increased, first plateaued and then started to declining. And then you have individual markets where crazy stuff happens. A good example is Japan. Okay, in Japan, crazy stuff happened earlier than in the rest of the world. And Japan, which is probably, when it comes to basic embryology research, the most developed place in the world today, they have the worst IVF pregnancy rates. And they have had the worst pregnancy rates over the last 12, 15 years by dramatic margins. There's long nothing after Japan. And it all happened because one guy in Japan developed a new protocol. And his marketing was incredibly successful, and he became the dominant center, and everybody followed him. And today, I think the whole country is using this so-called Kato Protocol. The guy's name, he's not alive anymore, but the guy's name was Kato. And using this Kato Protocol, which sounded beautiful because it meant mild stimulation, less medicine, only one embryo transferred at a time, all sounded more natural, more simple, less complicated, but it also reduced the national IVF pregnancy rates by 2/3. And when you look at the national data in Japan, what do you think happened in compensation to that decline by 2/3? They did exactly 3 times as many IVF cycles at the end of that time period. In other words, they ended up doing, having the same number of live births, but with 3 times as many IVF cycles. And one of the main arguments was that, oh, these cycles are significantly cheaper than the traditional cycles. But nobody then came out and told you, yes, but you need to do 3 cycles instead of 1. And that actually increased the costs by far over that cost of that original cycle. And this is what is happening, or has been happening over the last 10, 12 years in the IVF field, because stuff is constantly being sold, is being introduced under all kinds of weird claims, incorrect statistical analysis, and often not even knowing misrepresentation. A lot of colleagues believe in the stuff they're doing, but they just don't understand that if you calculate your pregnancy rates with reference point embryo transfer, that already means that you are just reporting outcomes in best prognosis patients, because a lot of IVF patients don't even make it to an embryo transfer. And if you only consider your pregnancy rates based on embryo transfer, you are not considering all those patients who didn't make it. And therefore, if you really want to do serious studies, you have to analyze your IVF outcomes based on what is called intent to treat, based on cycle start, not based on who makes it to get an embryo transfer. And things like that have become customary. And so as a consequence, it is hard to believe anything you're reading.
Yeah, I think it makes it really difficult to find independent research if you're going through it, which is where I think journalists can add so much value.
I agree.
That said, you and both you and Antonio have mentioned some of the aspects of marketing and like the spin that is on some of the information that comes out there. I'm wondering, Antonio, can you talk a little bit about like when you think that a company or an idea has enough weight to actually start reporting on it? How do you judge what might be too early and what might be too like in the research stage versus like waiting too long and somebody else has covered it already and it's not your story to break anymore?
I will. I think I just want to pick up on what Dr. Gleicher last said is, there's this fog of information, some of which is not true, et cetera. So there's definitely room for service journalism by reporters to say, these services, are worth it or not, egg freezing, PGD, et cetera, instead of touting them. The most valuable piece of information, and arguably the one that should be, in the newspaper most often, is simply the chart of, pregnancy rate by age. And it just goes off a cliff at what, 35, 36. That's the most important piece of information. So in a way, journalists could keep writing the same story, which is just to show that graph. It really is the most important one. Yeah, in terms of the new stuff, it often comes out in a scientific paper. What's fun is that sometimes you can predict what these things will be, and then it's a matter, at least for me, I'm just waiting for the fruit to ripen, so to speak. For instance, and I'll give you one that hasn't ripened yet, so everybody can try and jump in on it, is this thing with the uterus transplant, which is this fantastic development by surgeons in which the uterus of someone's relative, like an aunt or even a mother, and now even a deceased person, can be transferred to a woman who, for whatever reason, because of a congenital problem or cancer or something, doesn't have a uterus. And then there's been these live births. So if you think about it, you'd say, well, what would prevent a man from getting the uterus transplant? And then if you look in the literature, the scientific literature, you'll see a paper by the surgeon saying there is no obstacle. It's actually possible, according to the surgeon. And so this creates a circumstance for journalists, which is like, this has to happen. Someone will try this. It is inevitable. Maybe it's related to transgender, the needs of transgender people. I'm not sure, but it's going to happen. And so I'm in the position now of I'm trying to figure out who, right? Who's going to do this and when are they going to do it to get the scoop? I invite everybody to join me now in finding the 5 people who are at the cutting edge of uterus transplant to find out who's going to do it. So that's kind of the way the journalism side operates. It's kind of fun.
Can I raise another issue in that regard?
Please.
And that is, this is something that has been fascinating me for a long time, because the guy who really did this amazing job in taking uterine transplants from animals to larger animals and finally into humans is a friend and colleague in Europe who I only admire, because I can tell you as a personal vinaigrette that 25 or 30 years ago, we tried uterine transplants in rabbits, and we killed a few rabbits, and that stopped it. So was an amazing accomplishment by that group that started it all in Sweden. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, does it make sense? Does it make sense to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for a uterine transplant, for a temporary uterine transplant, which in most cases after one child is removed, and now in some cases after two children is removed? And considering the morbidity and considering complications, is that really something where we should put our emphasis, our dollars, our time? I do not have an answer for that, but it is an issue that is troubling to me because we don't do it. I have referred some patients, and every time I'm referring a patient or I'm having a discussion, I have a hard time finding a rationale to go for such a major surgery and long-term immunosuppressive therapy, which undoubtedly has effects on those women in the long term, when there are gestational carriers. And then you have the other extreme. I recently had a patient from the People's Republic of China. She's an executive. Her company is on the verge of going public. She doesn't have the time to have a baby. Her company is paying for her gestational carrier,
which is illegal in China, and why they come to the United States. Awesome story.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But those are, this is one of the most fascinating issues in our specialty. We are dealing day in, day out with those new issues that have no precedent, that have their own morality. But we are seeing extremes, On the one hand, you have the woman who will go through a uterine transplant and poisonous medicines for a long time to have the experience of carrying a baby. And on the other hand, you have the woman who is too busy to have a baby and just hires a womb.
I wonder if I could jump in for a second and maybe broaden the conversation slightly. It's been fascinating to hear about uterine transplants and all the IVF add-ons and it's really important to talk about whether they're efficacious, whether they work, whether women are getting ripped off in a sense or being misled. But there's another side of this too, and that's about the fact that 99% plus of the global population could not possibly afford these procedures, and we're at a moment in the United States where a significant percentage of the population seems to be fully on board with the idea that healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And the question becomes, is this healthcare? And if it does become, if IVF plus eventually is covered by Medicare or private insurance on a routine basis, what does that mean for the field? Will that happen? Should it happen? And how would the field change? Because it seems to me it would have some fascinating effects if that ever happened. I'd love to hear from everybody on that question.
Well, I can tell you we have this experience already to a large degree. In other words, we have the answers, at least to a degree, because when IVF started, there was no insurance coverage. Today, at least in the US, In Europe, there was pretty much from early on insurance coverage, but it was usually very limited. In the US, the situation has changed. There is now more and more private insurance coverage, though it is still limited. In some states, there's more because they have insurance mandates. In other states, there is less. But something interesting happened, and I have written about this as well. In the early days, when there was no insurance coverage, there was competition between IVF centers based on outcomes. In other words, in those early days, we all knew, and I would argue most patients knew, which center had the best rates and which center had the worst rates, and they chose their centers accordingly. CDC publishes rates for all IVF centers, but they have become so complex that the lay public really cannot understand them. Frankly, I sometimes can't understand them because obviously outcomes can be manipulated based on what you treat, who you treat, and who you don't treat. But something interesting happened. While initially the competition between IVF centers was based on who can achieve the best pregnancy rates, once the insurance business got involved in it and started selecting providers, the competition switched. The competition became a pricing competition. I offer you the best price, give me more patients as an insurance company. And paradoxically, at least in my analysis of data, that took away the impetus to produce best pregnancy chances. And I think that plays a big role in the declines that we are seeing. And on a related note, we were also the first 25 years ago to demonstrate that US IVF centers universally produced better pregnancy rates than our European colleagues, even though they were very smart and very good, did excellent research. And nobody understood why the difference. And apropos, that difference has diminished, but still exists. And I think the answer, paradoxically, was that Europe had insurance coverage while we didn't. There was less of an incentive to create high pregnancy rates.
I'm glad to hear you say that because, you know, a lot of people will say, well, we need national health care, but IVF in places where it's not covered in the United States provides the opposite example. It is one where you go into that fertility clinic and you're negotiating the price, you're trying to get free drugs, you're doing a lot of research, you know, you're working the angles and trying to, and you know, you really feel like the customer, it is a high price, but you're acting like someone who's going to pay for it, which is a huge difference from most things in medicine where you know you don't even know the cost, and in some ways you're not necessarily invested in finding out how it works and how to make it better and how to get the best deal. So for instance, if someone offers you PGD, which is this genetic test for an extra, I don't know what the extra is, at $2,500 or $2,000, you might say no just based on the cost. Right. $5,000. Okay. So I think it's a fascinating area to look at, you know, as medicine that people pay for. They have a lot of skin in the game.
Yep.
And good also for service journalism, because, you know, kind of can help people figure out how to run the gauntlet.
Yeah, but the other side of the coin obviously is that in Europe, everybody can have at least 1 or 2 IVF cycles. In the US, if you have public aid or Medicare, they don't cover it, and you cannot afford it. But just on a, since we're talking about it, interestingly, the countries that have at least superficially the most social health structure, the Scandinavian countries, they all have highly significant age limits for IVF. In Sweden, if you're over 40 as a woman, forget about it. You have to go to Denmark to get an IVF cycle done. Even in the private market in Sweden, which has grown, nobody will do IVF if you're 42. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Just in contrast, our median age over the last 3 years has been 43. In other words, if we were in Sweden, we would have no patients.
I was going to take this conversation a step further and look at IVF in low-income countries. I think we've talked about the US and Europe and China a little bit. But I think if you look at countries in Africa, you'd see a huge dearth of fertility clinics. And there are some really cool folks. I believe their nonprofit is called The Walking Egg, and they've been working to develop really low-cost IVF treatment. So I believe originally the idea that a lot of fertility scientists had was just, oh, why don't we just donate all of our old equipment? But that might not necessarily work in a setting where there isn't stable electricity to keep things frozen. And that is where you're incurring a lot of costs for opening new clinics, is like these massive bits of equipment. But I believe these folks at the Walking Egg are coming up with super cheap fertility options for low-income countries or areas that are underserved in general. And it's sort of interesting because it's almost like the opposite of tech. And in the sense of like, you're taking away a lot of these really fancy add-ons. You're just doing the basic needs of IVF. And I don't know, I wonder, is that something that you've covered at all, Antonio, in your research? I think it's really interesting as sort of a look at reproductive rights as a right to reproduce instead of the right to not have a child if you become pregnant.
Right. Well, we should talk about the right to reproduce, because it also influences the adoption of some of these technologies. I mean, the high-tech ones. In terms of poor countries, I think in general, the situation is inverted. People are having children younger, so the major cause, age-related infertility, may not be weighing as strongly there. I did have the chance, I needed to find, for some reason I was looking for people trying to use genetic testing to avoid sickle cell disease, right? It actually had to do with CRISPR, because with the gene editing, the National Academy of Sciences said, oh, we kind of agree with this gene edited baby situation, but technology, but only for very rare situations. And the only one they could really identify was two parents that both have sickle cell disease and therefore would not be able to have a child without it. And so they said, in that case, you could manipulate the embryo with CRISPR. So I said, well, I got to find some of these people. And so I went online and I got into sort of the Nigerian world of IVF. And so it turns out, there's a couple of big clinics there, 2 or 3, with lots of advertising online, and actually trying to educate people about the possibility of using genetic testing, not CRISPR, but genetic testing to avoid sickle cell disease. So it was fascinating to see this sort of education effort clearly aimed at people in Nigeria who are able to pay, right? The elite, I guess. But it was quite interesting to see a sort of totally different dimension of IVF, where they're really trying to use it as a diagnostic tool to help people have children without sickle cell disease. So that's as close as I've gotten to the sort of developing world IVF story.
There are organizational efforts underway. ESHRE, ASRM, International Society of Reproductive Societies, to develop a simpler IVF, a low-cost IVF, particularly for third world countries. And that is probably possible, and actually or I'm convinced, can be highly cost effective, because as Antonio said, it's a completely different patient population. In the developed world, our patients are getting older and older and older. In Africa and in other third world countries, it is still mostly a young patient population. And, we have now the saying, it doesn't matter what you put into the soup, they get pregnant. It's relatively easy to get them a decent pregnancy chance at very low cost. And I'm sure you're familiar with those intravaginal tubes where the woman serves as her own incubator for her embryos and carries those embryos in her vagina at body temperature. There are a few companies that are in the field and are promoting it, including one of the major pharma companies in our field, Ferring. And I would not be surprised if once it is tested and shown to work in the third world, it would also be successful even in the developed world. Because if, in thinking where IVF is going, I think IVF will follow more or less what has been happening in medicine in general. A big part of IVF is still relatively uncomplicated. Patients are young, simple, basic protocols, if followed, will give you very good results. And 95% of IVF centers, and we have over 500 in the US now, can have very good results in those patients. But roughly 15% are what we call poor prognosis patients. They are older, they have failed many cycles, they are younger but have very low ovarian reserve for whatever reason. And I think that doing IVF for these patients is a completely different story. And if I have to predict where IVF will be going over the next 10, 15 years, I think you will see a separation, a fork in the road, with IVF centers increasingly concentrating on simple IVF, inexpensive IVF for that large majority. And then there will be a relatively small number of centers distributed properly geographically that will just serve those more difficult cases, which will not get pregnant with that simple, basic, protocol-driven IVF, but will need individualized care. Like in other areas of medicine where medical treatments is going towards more individualization.
That's a great segue into something I wanted to talk about next, which is, as we're talking about these really difficult cases and we bring in this new technology, Antonio, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about like some of the ethics that you've encountered there, as there are some of these bigger and bigger ideas about what tech can do for fertility medicine.
Yeah, I like to read my daughter fairy tales, and a lot of these fairy tales begin, there's a middle-aged couple and they don't have a kid, right? And then they're wishing, and then a fairy comes and they get a kid, but it's not quite right? It's got wings, or it's got kind of some kind of sprite that they'll get. That's the premise of so many fairy tales. Now, technology makes this possibility kind of concrete, to your point, which is that, especially with the gene editing, there is this strong drive to apply it and to try and cure disease, although it's a little bit hard to say that an embryo that you're making has a disease. You've actually made it. And maybe to improve the species. I mean, this is a big deal. This is a big deal, and it's not going to stop. I mean, if anybody you talk to is like, they just say it's unavoidable. Even Jennifer Doudna, who kind of is the co-winner of the Nobel Prize, you know, she keeps saying, I say, aren't you against this? Aren't you against this? And she says, yeah, but it's unstoppable. And to me, that's like the most interesting, craziest thing that is going on. I mean, evolution, you know, people think about evolution as having a direction like towards improvement. It's that drawing of, you know, the fish turning into the ape into the man. Evolution doesn't really have a direction, but maybe it does have a direction to create a species able to take it over and accelerate it. So that to me is the stakes. And as a journalist, you know, I sometimes I'm not sure, am I in favor of this, or am I against it? Am I trying to expose what's going on to actually stop it? Like maybe it should not happen. I don't think everybody agrees that we ought to meddle in the genome. Like maybe this should actually be stopped. I don't know if that was the answer you were expecting, but it's a dilemma as a journalist, a kind of a for or against dilemma that I have.
I think it's the quintessential question in basic science in our field today. There's no question about it. We all want to produce eggs. We all want to produce sperm from stem cells, and I'm convinced that we will get there. But nobody knows at this point how to make the next step. What if we produce fresh eggs, fresh sperm? What if we can fertilize? How do we test out those resultant embryos to make sure that they're safe and healthy? I think that's where we will, at least for some time, hit the wall. I think producing eggs and sperm is going to happen quite soon.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, about this idea of, I guess, artificial eggs?
Yeah, well, this is a concept that has been by Japanese colleagues already successfully completed in mice. And from what I understand, and also some other small animals. We have not yet been successful in creating human eggs and human sperm and achieve fertilization and make human embryos. At least I'm not aware of it. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody has done it already quietly. There are, I would say, probably at least half a dozen, probably a dozen labs, good labs, actively working on this. And technically, it's just a matter of time until we can do it. The idea behind it is obviously revolutionary because the limiting factor in female age is the number of eggs. You know, a woman who is in menopause has practically no more eggs, and the number of eggs a woman has after age 43 is very small in most cases. So if you could take a little skin biopsy and create a stem cell line and then produce from that eggs, boy, it would end age as a limiting factor for reproduction. The uterus does not age. That is why some crazy colleagues in other countries have been able to get 60 and 70-year-old women pregnant. So the potential for pregnancies at very advanced ages is limited by eggs. And if we can produce fresh eggs from peripheral cells of any kind, then we have truly long-lasting fertility for everybody who wants it.
Do you think that that would also change, I guess, the fertility medicine for the LGBT community as well?
Of course. It's changing it already. The LGBT community has become a big client of the infertility industry at many different levels. Gay couples on both sides require fertility services. Gestational carriers are needed by a single man who may be straight or gay men who need a carrier. So the demand from that community has greatly increased, and there are IVF centers that basically serve almost exclusively just that community.
I think I was thinking more about if you had someone who wanted to transition, would it just be easier instead of going through a freezing cycle? Would it be easier? Or I suppose also if you have someone who has cancer, would it be easier to go through, I guess, going through like stem cells than going through a freezing cycle? I guess, especially in the case of cancer where you might want to start treatment immediately and you don't even have time to do that.
And even if you have time to do one cycle, you usually get only a relatively small number of eggs, and you know that does not necessarily give you much hope for the future. So yeah, obviously it would mean a lot, not only for older women. It would mean a lot for everybody who doesn't have eggs left. Now, it also raises questions. Let's talk, for example, about somebody who had cancer and had chemo for that cancer. What does that chemo, which is highly destructive to gametes, to eggs, and why women become sterile after many different chemotherapies, what does this same chemo do to our other cells? And for example, to the generation of stem cells from which we will want to make eggs. A question which we are discussing, but where we still don't have any answers really.
I was with one of these Japanese scientists who have pioneered this technique of making artificial eggs, sperm, and then making mice. And you know, he showed me a thing with a whole bunch of eggs. It was through a microscope field, but that's going to change everything because you don't just have, you know, 1 egg or 4 eggs. You could have potentially thousands of eggs. So then if you think about industrial concepts, that's going to become the substrate for doing a bunch of stuff that you couldn't do before. And I'm thinking about the far out things, like you can make many embryos, test them, and then you could pick the best one. Then you could really start to say, I'm going to use genetic weights and I'm going to try and have, you know, some kind of ideal child. Another thing he showed me was a picture of a bunch of eggs that had come from a male mouse, because a male has an X chromosome, and so through these eggs weren't totally normal, but it's possible that, you know, a man could generate an egg. It's kind of science fiction, but it is, you know, there's a direct technological line to it, which is that, you know, 2 men could have a child together. And for people who object to gay marriage, one reason is, well, you know, marriage is for a man and a woman to make children. But if literally 2 men can have a biological child together, then that'll be the final, you know, the downfall of the biological argument against gay marriage, at least.
Yep.
It's really, just jump in for 1 second. It's as a journalist, it's just very tempting to look ahead and be both fascinated and terrified. But it's also really hard to do those stories because we're so bad at predicting the future. We're always wrong, and it's a question of how wrong we are. Of course, it's not reasonable to expect we would be fully correct, but we're not even close. But I would love to hear everybody. You know, we've only got a few minutes left. Talk, you know, sort of look way ahead. And Antonio started to do that with this idea of choose your egg, choose your sperm, choose your ideal baby. But you know what? You know, there are a bunch of young journalists on this call. Katherine too. is still relatively early in her stellar career. But what will they be writing about 25, 30, 40 years out? And will it be just a free for all, or will we have will we be so concerned about these possibilities that the pendulum will turn the other way, and we'll have a very sort of heavy-handed, repressive restrictions on what can be done and how. What do you guys think about that?
Can I go first? Great question. In my experience, the journalist, at least myself, there's a certain kind of the shock factor of some of these technologies. It moves newspapers, it makes clicks, people are interested, it's exciting to think about. But what's fascinating is things that would have shocked the hell out of people 10 years ago don't shock them anymore. So the technologies that we're talking about now that seem, strange, they will just become part of the fabric of society in the future, and people will not debate them. IVF is certainly one example. Embryonic stem cells, getting these stem cells out of embryos, it was sort of the great issue that consumed the Bush presidency, and nobody even, you barely hear anything about the ethics and the questions about that. So what interests me is what could possibly be that urgent ethical issue of 2050? That would be so far out. What would it be? I kind of wonder if we're not going to have some kind of fertility crisis due to environmental factors or chemicals or poisoning. I mean, there's always these stories about male fertility declining. We have the coronavirus, which is scary. The whole world is frightened of it. But thank God it doesn't affect your gametes, apparently.
I'm not so sure about that.
Okay, exactly. So a real terrifying horror movie is a virus that goes around and leaves you infertile, because that's the end of the species. So.
Mumps does it. Mumps destroys testes. There's some data that the coronavirus acts similarly. So we don't know yet.
We don't know yet. It's barely been 9 months. That's my future cast.
Yeah. There is always this argument of the slippery slope in when it comes to reproductive medicine. I've heard that in the very early days of IVF, when some of the most prominent newspapers were projecting that monsters would be created through IVF. I never believed in the slippery slope, because you can always stop. I mean, whether we as scientists make the decision not to slide down, or whether government makes the decision, or other institutional setups like in the UK, I think society, as Antonio said, society learns. But it is our responsibility as the physicians, as the scientists, and I think also yours as the reporters, to educate. And I think we are not doing a great job in that regard always. And I include ourselves as physicians in that. These are complex issues, not only technically, they're morally complex issues, they're ethically highly complex issues. And the sooner we get society involved in discussing them openly, I think the better for everybody. So if I can make an argument, then it is to raise those issues and to write about them and to educate the public why it can serve mankind, or what the dangers are on the other side.
I would just say, like, for what I hope to be reporting on 25 years out from now, I would bring it back to what Dr. Gleicher brought up at the beginning of this conversation, which is looking at embryos as holding like the secrets to immortality. I'm super interested in aging research. And I think I guess the thing people talk about less in aging research is nobody actually wants to live forever. We want to live young forever. And so I'm sure there's a lot that could come out of embryology looking at that. We've got time for just about one more question here. We've had some questions about PGD specifically, Dr. Gleicher. You've talked a little bit about PGD and how it isn't actually helpful for IVF treatments, and it doesn't always produce more healthy babies at the end of the day. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And maybe that can be like our final case study of the night and of course, Antonio, you should weigh in too.
Okay, it's my pleasure because it is one of my major research areas over the last 20 years. And particularly in the last 5 years, in collaboration with Ali Brivanlo at Rockefeller Center. And we have, I think, a very important paper coming out in one of the Nature journals. PGT is an old idea. It's PGT, pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy, is really only its last name. It has gone through various generations, always with the same hypothesis behind, that if we can screen out chromosomally abnormal embryos before we put embryos back, the remaining embryos, the remaining chromosomally normal embryos, will give you better pregnancy chances and lower miscarriage risk. Sounds great. As I said earlier, it sounded so great when I first heard the hypothesis that I wanted to jump in. The problem is, it's one of those things that turned out to be categorically wrong. And it is categorically wrong because it's biologically wrong, which brings us back to how important basic embryology is. As we learned, and as we will show in the paper that is coming out in a few weeks, we were able to demonstrate that embryos have the ability to self-correct. Colleagues in the UK showed this for the first time a few years back in mouse embryos. But we were now able to show it in human embryos and in artificial human embryos made from stem cell lines. What does this mean? It means that when we really test an embryo currently in IVF, which is usually done on day 5 or 6, when the embryo reaches blastocyst stage, we take a few cells off, we analyze them. Even assuming for a moment that this test is technically correct, which it for other reasons not always is, even assuming that the result is correct and shows that there are some chromosomally abnormal cells in the biopsy, so what if that embryo can downstream still self-correct itself by eliminating chromosomally abnormal cells and continuing growth of normal cells? And that's really the main argument today, why this is, in my opinion, except for very rare circumstances, a useless test. As a consequence, many embryos that are being designated as chromosomal abnormal and therefore not being used and often or mostly disposed of, still have great pregnancy potential. We were so convinced of that already in 2014 that we started in 2014 transferring selectively some of those so-called abnormal embryos. And we were the first center in 2015 to report the first healthy babies born from transfer of so-called abnormal embryos. By now, hundreds of babies are born worldwide, if not thousands, from transfer of so-called abnormal embryos. So it is really, for most women, a useless test, and for some women, in our opinion, actually a harmful test. Because if you have 15 embryos and 3 or 4 are thrown out by mistake because they're false positives. No big deal. You will still get pregnant with the remaining 10. But if you're a woman who has only 2 or 3 embryos, and 2 of those are thrown out for the wrong reasons, you probably took away that patient's last chance of pregnancy. And so we are very outspoken against the use of pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy in most women, almost all women. And we do not recommend its use. Many centers feel differently. Excuse me, many IVF centers use it routinely on every cycle. Some centers even refuse doing IVF without it. But we feel that this is not a good way to practice IVF.
Actually, it's a professor at the SHIRP program, Steve Hall. Didn't he write the article, first big article about all this? So
yeah, Steve.
It's you know, it is fodder for journalism.
Yeah, Steve wrote that article a few years back in New York Magazine that really got us, for the first time, some exposure with our argument. I think by now we are on the winning side of the debate.
Well, thank you for that quick advertisement for SHIRP here at the end. We appreciate it. So this has been a totally fascinating discussion. Very grateful to Dr. Gleicher and to Antonio and to Katherine, especially Katherine for her moderating duties. She did a fantastic organizational job. But all good things must end. And I think this is the moment for us. Just a reminder to everyone, a week from today, we'll be back in this same space, talking about science policy and doing investigative science journalism on policies that people will actually read. And we have some great guests lined up. As always, journalism.nyu.edu/KC is the place to go to find out about these series. And it's also the place where you can watch recordings of past conversations, including this one. We'll have a recording of this up in, no more than a day or 2. So thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you online for sticking with us and asking such good questions. And we'll see you a week from today.